Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video, we'll be continuing on with the topic on becoming an adult. In the last video, I talked about some key ideas that I think revolve around the idea of what becoming an adult is. And some of those ideas were a little bit hard to, I think, fully capture due to the fact that I talked about them in rather just a conceptual way. In this video, I want to talk about a short story written by Hermann Hesse called Demian. In general, the story is written in the perspective of an older adult who's looking back into his younger self and the growth that he has had and the important events that he had during his youth. And I thought this book would be a great example illustrating some of the points that I discussed in my previous video. So what you see in the first slide is the first line of the book. I cannot tell my story without reaching a long way back. If it were possible, I would reach back farther, still into the very first years of my childhood, and beyond them into distant ancestral past. The idea of looking back into your personal history and looking them in a analytical way, trying to figure out what events in your past have led to the formation of your current self, I think is a very important step and one of the first steps into becoming an adult. And what's kind of interesting about this quotation is that even beyond your personal history, I think learning about your heritage first, your upbringing's background, and then also after that, you can even go further back, looking into the general development of human civilization. I think they're very interesting books that are a must read, including Homo sapien and its series, and also Guns, Germs, Steel by Jared Diamond. And in this book, Sinclair, who is the protagonist of the short story, as an adult, he is looking to re-examine some of the important events that have happened in his life in order to convey his message on what led to his growth. So, in terms of the flow of the story, he goes back to his childhood. The writer goes back to his childhood and describes the state of affairs in his home, his perspective on his parents, his sisters, the dynamics that occur within his family. And the first, I guess, important theme of the book that's introduced in the beginning of the story is about what is good and what is evil. He tells a false story about stealing an item to his friends and ends up having to steal money to pay one of his bullies who used Sinclair's false story to his advantage. This is his first divergence from the goodness of the values that were instilled into him in his childhood as from his family. And he struggles to reconcile the differences in values that he's learned from his family and his new experience of having to steal money. During his first crisis as a child, he meets the other protagonist of the story, whose name is Demian. So Demian is a boy raised by a single mother, and he's a few years older than Sinclair. Demian throughout the book is described to be quite close to all-knowing, wise, and very self-aware. This is one of the first deeper interaction between Demian and Sinclair. And Demian says to Sinclair, I can see that your thoughts are deeper than you yourself are able to express. You knew all along that your sanctioned world was only half the world, and you tried to suppress the second half. You won't succeed. Demian is saying this to Sinclair in reference to the two halves of the world, the good and the evil. And in this message, Demian is trying to relay to Sinclair that once you have thought about the differences between good and evil, you need to be able to understand both in order to live fully. So this is an example of, I guess, one of the first struggles that we all have as we move away from values that are instilled in us as a young child, and we think about what the world is full of for the first time. But as Demian put, it's important to develop the mind in order to be able to distinguish different values that exist in the world and different types of people that exist in the world in order to be able to further develop a personal value. The young adolescent Sinclair is confused, just like probably many of us were. Sinclair falls into the trap of nearsighted behavior. He meets a friend who he starts drinking with and looks for recognition among his peers for his identity. The friend that he met for the first time, he patted me on the shoulder, called me one hell of a fellow, and my heart swelled ecstatically at this opportunity to luxuriate in the release of a long pent-up need for talk and communication, for acknowledgement from an older boy. So if you go back to the idea of different forms of self and how there needs to be an increased understanding of internal self and external self for gradual improvement in self-awareness. This is an example of how young adolescent who has very low internal awareness, who does not have a fully developed internal self, and is focused on recognition from an external self. So rather than being driven by his internal values and internal desires, the focus of young Sinclair is extrinsic. He's trying to adopt values from outwards in. Short-term wise, this can be fulfilling due to the fact that the gap between external self and understanding of external self are closing. However, without a balanced development in the understanding of internal self and the development of it itself, it is not a sustainable sense of fulfillment. This is also the case for Sinclair. I wanted only to try to live in accord with the promptings which came from my true self. Why was that so very difficult? During boarding school for Sinclair, he has a lot of inner conflicts, and this quote is an example of his frustration. There is a big gap between the external self and internal self. How he understands his friends and his current companions view him, and the way that he wants to live and the things that he is conflicted about internally, there's a huge gap between them. And this leads to his frustration. If one feels that there is a big gap between the internal self and external self, the reason for that is probably because that person is controlling the external self to reflect as little as possible of the internal self. Now, to be able to control the external self to that degree is a great skill. However, if that control is not driven by self, but rather from the environment, then that gap between the internal self and external self is not one that the self necessarily wants. And I think that's the case for Sinclair at this time. Okay, so let's move on. I think good mentorship is one of the most important things you can have for development. And to be able to find a good teacher is a considerable fortune. So for Sinclair, he meets somebody named Pistorius. So Sinclair, in his journey on developing his internal self, meets somebody who is able to listen and understand and fill the gaps in Sinclair's understanding. So let's take a look. When you know something about Abraxas, you cannot do this any longer. You aren't allowed to be afraid of anything. You can't consider prohibited anything that the soul desires. Abraxas is the god of both evil and good. So he is the god of a world where both good and evil exist. And Pistorius explains that if a self desires something, whether or not that action is good or bad pursuant to somebody else or a different group's values, is not important to that self carrying on that action. In other words, the goodness and the badness of a certain behavior should be justified within and not from an external source. But Pistorius' message is not that every action has a justifiable means to an end, but it's important to focus on understanding why that self desires to do so. And then they will reveal their meaning. In summary, the things we see are the same things that are within us. There is no reality except the one contained within us. So I think what Pistorius is trying to say here is that life does not make you, but rather that you make your own life. In other words, you can learn from your external environment, but that environment cannot define you. The relationship between Sinclair and Pistorius ends rather negatively. As Sinclair approaches graduation of his prep school, Sinclair feels that Pistorius is incapable of applying his teachings to actual life. At the end of the relationship between Pistorius and Sinclair, Sinclair says, his function was perhaps to lead men to themselves as he had led me, but to provide them with the unprecedented, the new gods, was not in him. The writer Hesse is making a reference to Übermensch, the overman, the idea created by Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's idea was that an everyday man will follow the herd, but from time to time there will be an overman who is able to change the world, who is able to instill new values to the rest. But from my understanding, Nietzsche's idea of overman was that it's something that you are born with rather than something that you become. Personally, for me, how I see it is that if the meaning of life is driven by the development of internal self, and in effect, if the values of reality reflect the values that have been developed internally, then within the paradigm of your life, you are a overman. I don't believe that, like Nietzsche's overman, internally developed values become more valuable when they are shared with others. We focus on the development of the internal self for us and not for the external environment. The interaction with Nauer, a junior to Sinclair, where Nauer is looking to Sinclair for advice and help, Sinclair responds quite dismissively. And during, I think, critical points of our development, it may be difficult to be able to share what we know to somebody who is looking for help. But putting in the effort to help in the best manner possible goes a long way long term. And that experience in itself, I think, leads to important developments as well. So the last slide are a couple quotes from towards the end of the book. I've skipped a couple of events that lead to the final stages of Sinclair's internal development. I don't think the specificity of the event that Sinclair experienced is as important, but rather his relentless pursuit. So in the story, as an adult, Sinclair runs into Demian again. And the experiences with Demian show Sinclair that the most important thing is to define the world from within. The writer Hesse is really incorporating Nietzsche's idea of good and evil and as talked about before, overman, and also nihilism. On a more applicable level, I think rather than focusing on the ideas that Nietzsche had developed, I think it's important to think about the correlation between introspection and personal development. By focusing on trying to develop the internal self and to close the gap between internal self and external self, I think we approach a point where we feel a lot more at ease with ourselves and the environment around us. And like Sinclair did in the story Demian, looking back into your personal history and to synthesize important information about yourself for self-improvement is a very important step to becoming an adult. And I think the greatest value of that is in the last quote said by Demian to Sinclair. Perhaps you'll need me again sometime, against Cromer or something. If then, I won't come crudely, on horseback or by train. You'll have to listen within yourself, then you'll notice I am within you. Increase in self-awareness, I think, gives somebody an internal compass that directs them to better decisions for a future that holds many things unknown. So if some of the ideas that I talked about with regards to Demian interest you, it's not too long of a book, so have a read and let me know what you think about it. Thanks, guys.